Ren Oren had lived his life on the edge of the galaxy, drifting between worlds where the only rule was survival. The Void Marauder was his home, a rusted, weathered smuggler's ship, its hull scarred from countless skirmishes and escapes. The ship was as much a reflection of its captain as it was a tool of survival. Ren wasn't a hero nor a villain. He was a man who operated in the cracks, someone who understood that the galaxy had no place for idealism. In the farthest corners of the cosmos, the lines between right and wrong blurred into obscurity. Here, it was all about getting paid and getting away. Ren sat alone in the cockpit, his hands flying over the controls with practiced ease. A glimmer of stars outside reflected on the transparent dome above him, and the dull hum of the engines was the only sound that accompanied his thoughts. His crew, an eclectic mix of rogues and outcasts, were scattered throughout the ship, each busy with their own tasks, their own worries. There was Kai, his second in command, a brash and reckless man with a chip on his shoulder. Lyra, the ship's engineer, whose sharp mind and fierce independence kept the ship running even when things looked like they were falling apart. And then there was Elira, the quiet navigator who had a past she never spoke of. Together they made up the ragtag crew of the Void Marauder, and for the most part they got by. The mission they were on now was no different from the hundreds before it, a simple cargo run, a quick deal with a merchant on the planet Theta. The cargo was nothing special, some rare minerals, a few crates of illicit tech, nothing the Empire would miss. It was the kind of job that paid well and didn't ask too many questions. The kind of job that let Ren get back to the ship, drink a bit of whiskey, and forget about the rest of the galaxy for a while. But things had a way of changing when you least expected them. The mission should have gone smoothly. It was supposed to be an ordinary drop-off, a simple exchange with a middleman who'd promised to pay them well for their trouble. Instead, they found themselves on a station orbiting Theta, a place that seemed frozen in time. Old, abandoned, forgotten. It felt like the kind of place you didn't come to if you didn't have to. The kind of place that whispered danger, in a language only the desperate could understand. Ren could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end as he stepped onto the station's rusty docking bay. His boots clanked against the metal floor, echoing in the emptiness. The only sound was the soft hissing of air vents and the faint pulse of distant machinery. His crew followed closely, looking around warily. Something wasn't right. "What's the deal here?" Kai muttered, his hand hovering near the blaster at his hip. Ren didn't answer immediately. He was too busy taking in the station, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. The last time he'd been on a place like this was when a job had gone south, a job that had nearly cost him everything. The whole thing felt off. "Keep your guard up," Ren finally said, his voice low. As they moved deeper into the station's corridors, Lyra spoke up. "Ren, this place, it's not like the others. I can feel it in the walls." Ren didn't need to be told. He could feel it too. The unsettling silence, the weight of something unseen, lurking. They turned a corner, and that's when they found it. The artifact. It was hidden in a forgotten chamber, tucked away behind a wall that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in centuries. The walls were covered in strange, alien symbols, and the air felt thick with something unspoken, something ancient. But it was the artifact itself that caught their attention, a crystalline structure glowing faintly in the darkness. Ren didn't know what it was, but something about it screamed power. The rest of the crew stood around it in silence, unsure of what to do. The first to speak was Elira, the navigator. Her voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would break something delicate. It's not supposed to be here," she said, her voice shaking. "This isn't just any artifact, it's—" She stopped herself, unable to finish the thought. Ren approached it cautiously. There was something unnerving about the way it pulsed, a faint rhythm almost like a heartbeat. It called to him in a way he couldn't explain, a pull that felt both dangerous and inevitable. As his fingers brushed against its surface, a strange energy coursed through him, and for a moment everything went dark. Then a voice. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in any traditional sense. It was the voice of something older, something more ancient than anything he'd ever known, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You have awoken me," Ren jerked back, his heart pounding in his chest. The others looked at him, their faces pale. The voice continued, reverberating through the chamber, echoing in his mind. "You are worthy of... what kind of power?" The artifact pulsed again, its glow intensifying. "The power to change the very fabric of your galaxy, to destroy the empires that rule it, to remake it in your image." The offer was intoxicating. In that moment, Ren could almost see the galaxy kneeling before him, the crumbling empires, the shattered systems. It was too easy, too tempting to resist. But Ren had learned long ago that nothing came without a cost. "We didn't come here for this," Lyra said, her voice trembling. The crew was divided. Kai, always the ambitious one, stepped forward. "We've got a chance here, Ren. A real one. We could finally be more than just thieves running from the law. We could change everything." But Lyra shook her head. "We don't know what this is. We don't know what it wants." Ren didn't answer. His mind was racing. He had always lived in the margins of the galaxy, never quite belonging anywhere. But the thought of wielding that power, of reshaping the galaxy, of ending the endless wars and suffering, it was almost too much to ignore. As the voice of the artifact beckoned them, Ren had a choice to make. Would he take the power and risk everything for a chance at freedom? Or would he walk away, leaving the artifact to its secrets? The decision was harder than any he had ever made. Ren's fingers trembled slightly as they hovered over the crystalline surface of the artifact. The hum of its energy resonated in his bones, a sound both soothing and terrifying, like the whispered promise of something monumental. His heart raced as his mind grappled with the enormity of what he was holding. The decision was supposed to be simple. Either turn the artifact over to the Sci-Fi, the alien faction that had contacted them, or use it for themselves. But the voice, deep and resonant, reverberated in Ren's mind, as though the universe itself had spoken. The power it offered was unfathomable, far beyond anything the Void Marauder's crew could imagine. He could see it, his name etched into the annals of galactic history, a man who brought down empires with a single strike. He glanced at his crew. Kai stood closest, his eyes wide with greed and ambition, while Lyra remained at the far side of the chamber, looking uneasy. Lyra, as always, said nothing, her dark eyes only observing, calculating. There was a shift in the air, something unspoken that tugged at the very fabric of their bond. "What if we keep it?" Kai's voice was raw with excitement, his hand resting on the grip of his blaster as though ready to claim the artifact by force if necessary. Ren's gaze flickered from Kai to Lyra, then back to the glowing relic. "You heard what it said," Lyra replied, her voice tight. "We don't know what it could do. It's not just some weapon, it's something else, something ancient." "There's always a price." Lyra's voice cut through the tension, barely audible. "We're not the first to be tempted. You've seen what happens to those who try to control things they don't understand. You can't bend the universe to your will." But Ren was already moving. He couldn't resist. Not now. The power was too much to ignore. "We don't know what it is yet," Ren said, his tone firm, but beneath it a flicker of uncertainty. "But if it can do what it says, then we can end this war. We can free ourselves from the grip of the empires that have kept us shackled for too long." Kai grinned, but it was a hungry grin, one that suggested the hunger wasn't just for freedom, it was for power. "We can be kings, Ren. Kings of the galaxy." The artifact pulsed brighter, its glow intensifying. It responded to their words as if it understood them, as if it had always been listening. For a moment it felt like the whole station was alive, breathing with them. Ren's hand made contact. The power surged through him in an instant. He gasped, the air seemingly sucked from his lungs, his body convulsing under the overwhelming force. Images flooded his mind, visions of entire star systems collapsing, planets reduced to ashes, fleets falling before the wrath of the artifact's power. He saw himself standing before the wreckage, The last man standing in a galaxy of ruin. Stop. Lyra's voice broke through his haze of visions, but it was too late. The connection had been made, and Ren could feel the weight of it settling into his chest. The power was his, but with it came a chilling realization. This wasn't just a weapon. It was an instrument of control, a force that could break the galaxy into pieces, leaving no place for anyone to stand. The artifact had no master. It only had those who wielded it. Ren stumbled back, shaking his head as if trying to shake off the vision. But it lingered, the knowledge now planted deep within him. The galaxy would bend whether they liked it or not. Ren! Lyra's voice was sharp, filled with panic. What did you do? The crew rushed to his side, but he barely noticed them. His thoughts were already racing ahead, mapping out possibilities, consequences. Kai looked like he wanted to argue further, but instead he sighed, a mixture of frustration and understanding crossing his face. I'm not saying we should run from it, but we need a plan. This thing, it's dangerous. It's already messing with our heads, Ren. Ren turned finally, locking eyes with Kai. We survive first, then we figure out what comes next. As Kai left, Ren turned back to the viewport, his reflection merging with the vastness of space. He had always believed that the universe ran on rules, on logic, on the cold, hard reality of survival. But this artifact was changing everything. It wasn't just a weapon. It was something older, something that seemed to bend the very laws of nature. And as much as he hated to admit it, it was something he didn't fully understand. Meanwhile, in the belly of the ship, the crew was already in chaos. Lyra had holed herself up in the engine room, her hands working furiously over the ship's systems as though trying to drown out her mounting panic with mechanical tasks. She wasn't the type to get rattled, but this felt different. The artifact, the way it pulsed and hummed like it was alive, like it was watching them, it unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. Lyra said, her voice tight as the other woman entered the room. What's going on? Why? Is Ren so determined to keep that thing? Lyra leaned against the doorway, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. You know why. He believes in the power it gives us. He's always believed in power. The rest of us, though, we're just along for the ride. Lyra shot her a look. You don't believe that. I don't believe in anything anymore. Lyra replied, her tone flat. Not after everything we've seen. We've crossed a line, Lyra. The artifact doesn't just change things. It controls things. Lyra bit her lip, her mind racing. She'd always been a pragmatist, but something about Lyra's words struck her to the core. What if it's too much? What if we can't control it? There's no what if anymore, Lyra said softly. We're already too far gone. The Empire's going to come for us. And when they do, we'll have to decide what we're willing to sacrifice to survive. Back in the cockpit, Ren was already making preparations. The countdown to their next jump was ticking down, but it wasn't the ship's systems that had his attention. It was the artifact, lying in the heart of his vessel, its power pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't lift. The voice had stopped speaking directly to him for now, but its influence lingered, like a shadow in his mind. He didn't know what would happen when they reached their next destination, a remote system where they hoped to lay low for a while. But he did know one thing for sure. There would be no going back. The artifact was no longer just a tool, it was a force. And in the hands of someone who was desperate enough to use it, it could reshape everything. Ren leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as the jump countdown continued. He could already feel the first tendrils of fear creeping up his spine. They were in deep now, deeper than they had ever been. And as the countdown hit 0, the stars outside the ship's viewport stretched into nothingness, an abyss that seemed to mirror the uncertain future that awaited them. The void Marauder shot into hyperspace, its path now irrevocably tied to the artifact and the empire it would one day challenge. The crew, divided, moved silently through the ship, each with their own thoughts, their own fears. The galaxy was about to change, and whether it was for Better or worse, no one knew. But one thing was certain. The Void Marauder was no longer just a smuggler's ship. It was a weapon that could either save the galaxy or destroy it entirely. The universe was vast, but in this moment, it felt like it was closing in on Ren. The Void Marauder dropped out of hyperspace with a violent lurch, the starfields, outside twisting and stretching back into their natural shape. Ren gripped the ship's control panel, his heart pounding in his chest. The space around them was quiet, eerily so, but he knew it was only temporary. The Empire was out there, and they were coming. The coordinates had brought them to a barren system, far from the crowded routes of Imperial traffic, the perfect place to hide for now. But the artifact had already set things in motion, and hiding was no longer an option. The Empire had already caught wind of the Marauder's location, and they weren't far behind. Soon their fleet would arrive, and when it did, they would stop at nothing to take the artifact. Status? Ren barked into the comms, his voice rough. Lyra's voice came through, strained but steady. The systems are online, but the artifact, it's starting to resonate. The more we move, the more unstable it feels. I don't think it's safe to keep it aboard for much longer, Ren. I know, Ren muttered under his breath, his gaze flickering to the control panel. He felt the ship pulse in time with the artifact's quiet hum, the energy growing stronger as if feeding off their fear, their uncertainty. The Empire was close, and there was no turning back. The weapon was too powerful to surrender, but Ren couldn't ignore the truth that had been creeping up on him. The artifact, this ancient creation, was far beyond their control. It wasn't a tool to wield. It was a storm waiting to break. Ren, Kai's voice cracked through the intercom. We need to make a decision now. The fleet's coming, and we can't outrun them. What's the plan? Ren's eyes hardened. He knew what needed to be done, even if it wasn't the choice he had wanted to make. The weapon could be used to kill empires, but that wasn't why they were here. They were here to survive. They needed to stop the Empire from claiming it. That meant they would have to risk everything. We fight, Ren said, his voice low and resolute. We use the artifact to take them down. We destroy the Empire's fleet before they have a chance to stop us. This is our only shot. As the ship's weapon systems hummed to life, the crew gathered. In the war room, their faces taut with fear and determination. They had crossed the point of no return. The power to obliterate fleets was in their hands, but so was the potential to unleash something far worse. It was the kind of decision that had no clear right or wrong answer, only survival or extinction. I can't believe we're doing this, Lyra muttered, her fingers tightening around her datapad. One shot, and the whole galaxy could change. But at what cost? Ren met her gaze, his expression unwavering. We don't have the luxury of second chances, Lyra. The Empire won't stop. They'll come for us, and they'll burn everything down if they have to. We end it now, or we end up as ashes. Lyra stepped forward, her face pale. We're not just fighting the Empire anymore, Ren. We're fighting the artifact's will. Do you really think it's going to let us control it once we've used it? Once we've unleashed its power? Ren didn't answer. He couldn't. The fear had already taken root in him, but he knew what needed to be done. The decision had been made. There was no going back. The distant thrum of Imperial engines echoed through space, and then, in a flash, the Empire's fleet appeared, warships materializing from the darkness like monsters from a nightmare. The Void Marauder was small, a smuggler's ship by design. But now, it was about to become the galaxy's most dangerous weapon. Ren slammed his hand onto the ship's controls, activating the artifact. The ship shuddered violently, the power surging through every system. The artifact responded with a pulse of raw energy, sending a shockwave out that rattled the entire vessel. The crew braced themselves, feeling the shift in the very air around them. The Empire fleet was now within range. Brace for impact, Ren shouted, his voice strained. Suddenly, the Void Marauder surged forward, its weapon systems locking onto the Imperial ships. The artifact's energy surged once more, and with a single command, the ship unleashed its devastating power. Albasa, beam of pure, unrelenting energy tore through the fabric of space, carving a path of destruction that obliterated the closest Imperial cruisers in the blink of an eye. The massive ships erupted in a storm of fire and debris as if they were nothing more than paper in the face of an unstoppable force. For a brief moment, the crew stood frozen, watching the carnage unfold. The Marauder's systems were overloaded, with energy, the artifact working faster than they could process. And yet, even in the midst of the destruction, there was an uncomfortable realization. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight for something far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. The artifact wasn't simply a weapon, it was a living force, and it was now alive within them. The Void Marauder shook again, and Ren fought to maintain control, his mind racing. "We've got to shut it down. We can't keep using it like this." But the artifact had other plans. A surge of energy flooded through the ship, and suddenly the space around them bent and twisted, reality warping under the strain of the artifact's unleashed power. The ship's systems began to short-circuit, alarms blaring as the chaos intensified. The energy needed to sustain the weapon was ripping the fabric of the Marauder apart. The very ship was beginning to buckle under the weight of its own power. "We can't stop it," Lyra screamed over the comms. "The ship can't take this much energy. Ren, we need to shut it down." But it was too late. Another wave of energy blasted outward, this time aimed at the heart of the Empire's fleet. The Imperial ships were too close to avoid the blast, and entire sections of their armadas vanished in a burst of light, leaving only the remnants of their once proud ships drifting. The artifact's voice, cold and dispassionate, echoed in Ren's mind. "The end has come. This galaxy is mine to reshape." In that final, shattering moment, the Void Marauder lurched violently, as if the artifact itself was beginning to collapse under its own weight. The crew was thrown to the ground, the ship spiraling uncontrollably as its systems went dark one by one. Ren's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know if they were going to survive this, but he had no other choice. There was only one thing left to do. With all the strength he could muster, Ren slammed the emergency shutdown on the artifact, hoping that, just for a moment, they could regain control. He had no way of knowing if the artifact would comply, or if it had already begun its conquest of the galaxy. As the Void Marauder drifted, battered and broken, through the remnants of the battle, Ren stared into the void, his mind still racing, unsure of what he had unleashed. Had they won? Or had they merely set the stage for something far worse? The silence that followed the destruction was deafening. The Void Marauder floated in the aftermath, its hull scarred from the battle, the crew barely holding on as the remnants of the Empire's fleet drifted like broken skeletons in the vast emptiness of space. The ship's systems were in critical disarray, lights flickering sporadically as sparks flew from exposed wiring, and the hum of life support was reduced to a faint, hollow echo. The artifact had unleashed its full fury, and in doing so, it had nearly torn apart the ship that had once been its vessel. Ren sat at the helm, staring out into the stars, the weight of the last few moments crushing down on him. His hands gripped the controls, but his mind was somewhere far beyond the broken remains of the Empire's fleet. His thoughts churned with the choices they had made, the actions they had taken. There was no going back now. The galaxy had changed, and they had changed with it. We did it," Kai said, his voice quiet, almost uncertain as he entered the cockpit. His tone lacked the victory it should have carried. The brash man, who had always wanted to fight for something bigger, now seemed unsure of the price they'd paid. Ren didn't respond at first. He was too lost in the enormity of what had just transpired. The battle had been a resounding victory in terms of destruction, but the cost had been too high. They had won, but at what cost? "Yeah," Ren finally muttered, his voice hollow. "We did it, but it wasn't victory. It was something darker, something more uncertain." Below deck, the crew was scattered, each of them dealing with the aftermath in their own way. Lyra was in the engineering room, muttering to herself as she tried to repair what little she could of the ship's broken systems. But every part of her was consumed with the gnawing realization that the artifact had not only destroyed the Empire's fleet, it had destroyed a part of them too. The ship felt different now. as if it was no longer just a ship but a prison that held them all captive to its power. Elira stood alone in the observation deck, her gaze fixed on the stars outside. The Sci-Fi had been right. The artifact hadn't been just a tool, it was a force, something that couldn't be controlled by anyone, no matter how desperate they were. The galaxy was teetering on the edge of something unknown, and none of them knew how to navigate it. The artifact had changed everything. In the quiet of her mind, Elira had a question that she hadn't dared to ask aloud. What happens now? The ship drifted through space, slowly limping toward the next unknown destination. There was no clear plan, no immediate destination. Their fight had been won, but the war was far from over. The Empire had been dealt a devastating blow, but the galaxy was full of other forces, other factions, who would undoubtedly rise to fill the vacuum. And then there was the artifact itself, still alive within the ship, still holding an unyielding grip on their fate. Ren looked at his crew one last time, each of them scattered, lost in their thoughts. He knew they could never go back to the way things were before. There would be no more small jobs, no more simple heists. They had become something more, something far larger than the sum of their parts. They had become the trigger that set off the next stage of galactic history, whether they liked it or not. Is this what we wanted? Lyra asked, her voice breaking through the silence as she entered the cockpit. Her face was a mix of exhaustion and something else, something she couldn't quite place. Ren didn't answer immediately. He didn't know. Maybe it wasn't about what they wanted. It was about what they had to do to survive. The artifact had given them that chance. But the price was steep. Does it matter? He said finally, his voice thick with the weight of it all. What's done is done. Lyra looked at him, her eyes full of questions, but she didn't ask. Instead, she just sat beside him, both of them staring out at the dark expanse ahead. The Void Marauder was more than just a ship now. It was a symbol of everything they had fought for and everything they had sacrificed. The galaxy might be changing, but for better or worse, they had set that change in motion. The Empire was shattered, its fleet broken. The remnants of its once feared war machine lay scattered across the void, but the galaxy was far from a peaceful place. New factions would rise, new conflicts would emerge, and the balance of power would shift in ways that no one could yet predict. But there was one thing that had become painfully clear to Ren. The artifact, this ancient weapon, had not been simply a means to an end. It had been a force in itself, with its own will, its own destiny, and now that power was theirs to face, to control, or be consumed by. As the Void Marauder limped away from the wreckage of the Empire's fleet, the crew was left to reckon with the truth that had been hanging over them since the artifact had first called to them. Power, unchecked and unrestrained, could either save the galaxy or destroy it. Ren clenched his fists, his jaw set in quiet resolve. He wasn't sure what the future held. The artifact's power was a ticking time bomb, and he knew it. But he couldn't afford to stop. Not now. The stars stretched on ahead, endless and cold, as the Void Marauder drifted forward. The crew, weary, but resolute, prepared for whatever would come next. They had survived the battle. But the war had only just begun, and as the ship glided deeper into the unknown, one thing was certain. The galaxy had never seen anything like what was coming. The Void Marauder was no longer just a ship. It was a catalyst, a force that would change the course of everything. The galaxy was theirs for the taking. But at what cost? And that question would echo unanswered through the stars. The Void Marauder drifted further into the emptiness of space, its damaged hull groaning with every movement, the remnants of battle still clinging to its metal frame. The crew had retreated into their own spaces, nursing wounds, reflecting on choices made, and trying to grasp the enormity of what had just unfolded. The silence between them was thick, weighed down by the knowledge that the galaxy and they themselves were now irrevocably altered. Ren stood alone in the cockpit, his hands gripping the controls, but his mind was far beyond the stars they sailed through. His thoughts were fractured, torn between a hope for a future where they could reshape the galaxy and the grim reality of the path they had set in motion. The artifact, that ancient weapon of unimaginable power, lay silent in the heart of the ship, its influence still pulsing through every system, through every crew member. They had destroyed the Empire's fleet, but that victory felt hollow, its brilliance fading with every passing moment. The galaxy was vast, and there were forces far greater than the Empire that would rise in response to the power they had unleashed. The void before them seemed to mock their uncertain victory. Ren's hand hovered over the comms, but he hesitated. What was left to say? The crew had already made their choices, and no amount of words could undo what had been done. He glanced. Over at the small crew quarters where Lyra and Kai were discussing repairs, their voices quiet, distant. Elira had withdrawn into the ship's observation deck, as she often did, her gaze always fixed on the stars, lost in thought. They were no longer just a group of smugglers. They were something else now, an instrument of chaos, or perhaps of salvation. A low, almost imperceptible hum filled the cockpit. The artifact, still dormant, seemed to pulse in rhythm with Ren's heartbeat, as if it knew the uncertainty that plagued him. It had granted them victory, but at what cost? What had they truly won? Far from the void Marauder, the galaxy was beginning to feel the ripples of the events that had unfolded. The Empire's fall had sent shockwaves through every star system, each one now vulnerable to the chaos that would follow, and in the shadows of the galaxy's corners new players were already taking note. The Scythi, the ancient alien faction that had warned them of the artifact's true power, watched from afar, their interest piqued. They had known that the void, Marauder, was a key to something far greater than even Ren or his crew had realized. But they had never predicted that the artifact would be used so recklessly. The galaxy was now teetering on the brink, and the Scythi's cryptic warnings had not been for. In the depths of the galaxy, a different kind of stir began. The relic was not the only one of its kind. There were others, scattered across forgotten worlds, hidden in the depths of dead civilizations. These artifacts had been buried for millennia, left untouched by those who knew of their destructive potential. But now the Void Marauder's reckless activation had sent a signal, awakening something far older, far more dangerous. The artifact had called out, but so had others. Back aboard the Void Marauder, Ren stared into the endless sea of stars, knowing that the future would not be kind to them. The ship was battered, the crew weary, and the artifact still pulsing with unrelenting power. But there was more at stake than their survival now. The artifact had granted them a victory, but it had also made them a target. You know they're coming for us, right? Lyra's voice cut through the silence, her face weary but resolute as she stood in the doorway of the cockpit. Ren didn't turn to face her immediately, but he knew the truth in her words. The power they had unleashed was not something the galaxy would allow to go unchecked. I know. We're not done yet, are we? She pressed, stepping closer. There's still too much left unanswered. No, Ren admitted, finally turning to look at her, his gaze tired but firm. This is only the beginning. Lyra paused, her expression darkening as she gazed out at the stars. What are we going to do, Ren? We can't fight forever. Ren met her eyes, his own filled with the same uncertainty that had haunted him since they activated the artifact. We don't have a choice. Not anymore. We're tied to this now. But we've got something they don't have. A head start. Meanwhile, the signal they had unknowingly broadcasted rippled out across the galaxy. Faint at first, but growing stronger with every passing moment. Unseen, unknown forces moved toward the heart of the galaxy, drawn by the artifact's call. Ancient powers, some even older than the Scythi, were beginning to stir, preparing for a return that no one had anticipated. And then, in the quiet darkness of space, a single transmission flickered through the void. It was a message, a warning, or perhaps an invitation. To the ones who seek to reshape the galaxy, you are not alone. We are watching, we are waiting. The Void Marauder was heading into uncharted territory, both literally and figuratively. The crew was divided between fear and resolve, but they all knew the same thing. There was no turning back. The artifact was alive, and it had brought them to this precipice. Now they would have to face what lay beyond it. The galaxy was about to change forever, and with it, the fate of the Void Marauder's crew. As they drifted forward, the stars ahead seemed colder, their light dimmer. The darkness of space had always been a place of endless possibility, but now it was something else entirely. Ren's hand hovered once more over the ship's comm system, but instead of sending a message to his crew, he sent it out into the unknown, a single transmission that could very well be their last. "We're coming," he said quietly into the empty comms, "and we'll see this through no matter what happens." The Void Marauder's engines hummed to life once more, pushing them further into the void. The galaxy was vast, full of dangers, but it was also full of opportunities. Opportunities to seize power, to conquer, to destroy, and they were about to discover just how far those opportunities could take them. The story of the Void Marauder was far from over. It had only just begun. "We need to leave. Now," he muttered, his voice distant. But before they could make a move, the ground shook beneath their feet, and the walls around them trembled as if reacting to the artifact's activation. The station's lights flickered. Something was happening, something that was beyond their control. Then the voice spoke again, only this time, it was not just in Ren's mind. "You have awoken me," it said, its tone rich with ancient power. Ren froze, his blood running cold. He had expected the artifact to be silent, to be just an object of power, but it wasn't. It was alive, and it had a will of its own. "You will use me, or you will perish," the voice continued, sending a shiver down Ren's spine. "Your empire-killing ambitions will only lead to your doom. Do not be so arrogant as to believe you control this power." Ren's breath caught in his throat. There was a twisted irony in the words. The weapon they had hoped to control now seemed to mock them, as if it had always been one step ahead. "We've made a mistake," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible, but her words resonated in the silence. The realization hit them all. At once, this wasn't just a tool. It was a force, and like any force, it was indifferent to their desires. It could destroy, yes, but it could also rebuild, reshape, or even consume them all. Suddenly, the ship's sensors blared, a warning of an incoming force. Imperial ships. They had detected the artifact's activation. The galaxy's empires, vast and uncaring, had taken notice. The Void Marauder was now a target, no longer just a smuggler's ship. It was something far more dangerous, and its crew was caught in a web they couldn't escape from. As the blaring alarms filled the ship, the crew hurried back to the Void Marauder, their minds spinning. The walls seemed to close in, and yet, the universe beyond stretched out in every direction, full of possibilities and perils. The galaxy was about to change, and whether they liked it or not, they were going to be the ones who pulled the trigger. But the question that haunted Ren as they jumped to warp speed was simple. Would they be able to control the weapon, or would it control them? The Void Marauder had never been the type of ship that invited attention. In fact, Ren had always prided himself on that. The Marauder was a shadow in the void, slipping through the cracks of the galaxy unnoticed, unremarkable. But now, as it hurtled through the vast emptiness of space, it was anything but inconspicuous. The artifact had marked them, and its presence on the ship had set off a chain of events that could not be undone. The hum of the ship's engines seemed louder than ever, as if in protest against the impending storm. Ren paced back and forth. In the cockpit, the ship's control panel blinking with warnings. Outside the viewports, the stars stretched in a blur of hyperspace as they made their escape, but Ren's mind was far from the route they were taking. His thoughts were consumed by the artifact, and by the Empire, which had already mobilized to track them down. "They'll be coming," Ren muttered to himself, his eyes flickering between the instruments. The Empire wasn't just going to let something like this slide. If they knew even a fraction of what the artifact was capable of, they'd send everything they had to destroy it, and everyone who possessed it. "Ren," Kai's voice broke through his reverie. The man was standing in the doorway, his face a mix of impatience and excitement. "I know you've got a lot on your mind, but we've got a situation back here. We need to talk." Ren's gaze hardened, and for a moment, it felt like the ship itself was holding its breath. He didn't turn to face Kai. Not yet. "What's the situation?" "We've got some cracks in the crew," Kai said, stepping into the cockpit. "Lyra's panicking and Elira's just watching everything burn. We need to decide what to do with the artifact, and soon." Ren ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. He knew the crew was divided. Hell, he was divided. He could feel the artifact's pull, and deep down, he knew it was beginning to change him. But this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the galaxy. If the Empire found them, they'd be nothing more than ashes. If they played their cards right, they could take the fight to the heart of the Empire. "We don't have time for indecision," Ren said, his voice tight. "The artifact stays with us for now. It's the only bargaining chip we've got." "That's exactly the problem," Kai snapped, leaning against the control panel. "You think we're bargaining? We're holding a weapon that could wipe out entire fleets, entire planets. What happens when we use it? What happens when it starts to control us instead?" Ren was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the stars outside. He had already considered that very possibility. "We're not just holding it, Kai," Ren said quietly, his voice taking on a bitter edge. "We're trying to survive. If we don't,